Possession of pot could just yield a ticket, and the governor and legislature fight over the budget. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state government, sometimes the federal government, and how it just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. A lot going on in the Capitol in these supposedly waning days of the legislative session. With me today, Bruce Rushton is back, a reporter in Springfield with Illinois Times, the weekly.
Yes.
Bruce,
thanks
welcome.
For having me.
And Andy Maloney is here, State House reporter, Chicago Daily Law Bulletin. So we're going to talk some legal stuff, Andy.
That's good. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Okay. Marijuana, everybody's talking about the budget and the turnaround agenda, but for a while, let's just talk about something that may be kind of a movement that fits in with things happening across the country. The legislature has voted. I'm not sure if everybody's calling it decriminalization, but you could get a ticket for less than 15 grams of marijuana. And that we don't know what the governor is thinking of that yet, but just some thoughts on that. Illinois used to be almost impossible for legislators to vote to soften our view of crime, but this seems to be what's happening. Andy?
Yeah, this is something that when you hear people around the State House talk about criminal justice reform, this is usually one of the things that one of the few specifics that they've always mentioned, at least in recent years, which is, these low-level kind of marijuana possession charges. Should we really be sending people to prison for a long time for this? And while that might have become more rare over the years, I think it's become more palatable for people to do. We've seen states across the country, really, especially in the South, when you talk about states like Georgia or Texas, have done similar things like this. And it's sort of gotten out there and become acceptable for people to make this vote. There's been legislative committees. The governor created a committee. They've kind of thrown this around for a little bit, and we see it just this session get a vote and go to the governor. But like you said, we don't exactly know what Governor Rauner's going to do with this yet.
Yeah, but let's make no mistake here. Nobody's going to prison in Illinois or pretty much anywhere else for a half ounce of weed.
Well, they used to.
Well, they used to, but
time.
Nixon's no longer in office. And so what we've got going on here is that this is de facto criminalization. It's a $125 ticket for possession of up to a half ounce of marijuana, plus fairly easy, straightforward expungement. And after I think 6 months, it's as if it never happened. So stop and think about the effect this might have on the medical marijuana program, because it's $150 to get a marijuana card these days, and that's $100 to the state, plus $50 for a fingerprinting fee, plus you got to renew every year at the cost of $100, plus you got to pay to go see a doctor to get the doctor to recommend marijuana for you, and that's not necessarily easy, and that's reflected in the low numbers of folks who've actually got medical marijuana cards. I think that's hovering around 2,000 right now, which is completely unsustainable in terms of sustaining a medical marijuana industry in Illinois. Now you add this to the mix, what are you going to do? Well, am I going to go through all that rigmarole, or am I just going to take my chances? And the worst thing that's going to happen to me is if I get caught, it's $1.25 and it's off my record in 6 months. That's kind of an easy call for most folks to make. So I think it puts more pressure on the medical marijuana industry, and the folks that end up with cards, frankly, are folks that don't know where else to buy weed from. So
some people just follow the law all the time, Bruce.
Well, that's true, but nobody at this table would know perhaps what that's like. Well, maybe you might.
Well, what is interesting also is Lou Lang, who is the state representative from Skokie, who pushed the medical marijuana thing, has been pushing for an extension of the time of the test program to go 4 years from when the first clinic opens, because it was supposed to be 4 years, but we're almost like a year and a half or two into it. Nobody is up and running yet, and people are investing hundreds of thousands or more in these operations.
Well, I haven't seen any ground turned. And frankly, not to interrupt.
And the governor doesn't want to move that forward anyway, or has not expressed interest in doing that at this point.
This whole medical marijuana program, it strikes me as the state wanting to be a little bit pregnant, and that never works. And so you're going to do it or you're not going to do it. And they're taking these tiny little baby steps. The fact that they found investors in at least one case have gotten cold feet and withdrawn their application for cultivation center. This was supposed to be a license to print money, and that folks aren't necessarily they they didn't get, let's face it, a huge number of applications to go into the marijuana business in Illinois.
They're very limited on, I mean, they have a strict list of ailments under which you can see your doctor and do this. And truly, this is one of those, it's kind of I view this as a sea change in attitude across the country. Now that we have Colorado where you can, legally buy marijuana.
It's Colorado, it's Alaska, it's Washington, it's District of Columbia, and I believe, or did I say Oregon? I mean, there's 5 jurisdictions now where recreational marijuana is legal. I mean, this is...
And the world has not collapsed, and it really has changed, because I think, Illinois is progressive in some things, but in crime, we've not been that progressive on some things. And it was a tough vote just a few years ago to say, because come election time, you still get people sending out the flyers. Oh, your state representative voted to make pot legal. He's a lawless kind of person.
It was amazing because I think it was tried. They had a couple votes leading up until it was fairly legal.
Oh, it
and
was
they
hard
get
to
a little
pass.
bit closer, a little bit closer, a little bit, and it just squeaked by.
Right.
And now it's like, hey, dude. Let's,
we'll see what I don't think we're Colorado yet, but again, we don't know exactly where the governor is on it.
Right. It's interesting, I think, to see him at least not be explicit with what he wants to do on this, because if you remember from the campaign, I mean, he coined that phrase competitive and compassionate, and the criminal justice reforms were what at least I always interpreted as being sort of part of that compassionate messaging. He had created the reform committee that is still meeting and is supposed to make recommendations, I think, perhaps by July or December later.
I think by the end of the
year.
year.
By the end of the year.
Yeah, but they want to lower prison population by 25% by, what was it?
2025.
Yeah, 2025. So this would seem to be, I think, in that wheelhouse a little bit, but he hasn't made his intentions known, so we'll see what happens.
Yeah, we will find out. Bruce, I know you are aware of a new study, speaking of prisons, and I know the governor visited a prison and talking about being appalled at the conditions there. There's a new study out about prisons in Illinois where...
It is absolutely a devastating report. It's a little in excess of 400 pages. It was prepared by a panel of experts, a court-appointed panel of experts, in response to a class action lawsuit filed by inmates who allege that medical care in Illinois prisons is so substandard as to violate their constitutional rights. And this panel has agreed with that. And the panel is headed by a physician who was once, I believe, head of medical care of the Illinois state prisons. So this isn't somebody coming in from Vermont or Hawaii or what have you. This is somebody who's familiar with the prisons and how they're supposed to work. I mean, it's stomach churning reading some of this stuff. You have an example of an inmate who died. He had Alzheimer's disease. He was incontinent. He's on a feeding tube, and he died of pneumonia and saw a physician just twice, I believe, in the last 6 months of his life. When he passed away, he was crusted over with phlegm. I mean, thank you, TV viewers. But you had another gentleman, an inmate, who was diagnosed with cancer, and it was fairly obvious to him that he was dying of cancer because he had extreme weight loss. He had a history of smoking in his family. He'd been a smoker. He deteriorated and deteriorated. It got to the point where he was in a wheelchair. He couldn't stand up straight anymore, filing grievances saying, I think I have cancer. Please get me to a doctor. Sure enough, when they finally did the appropriate test, the tumor had wrapped itself around his heart, around his airways. I mean, when the patient knows they have cancer before the doctor does, there's an issue. You had stuff going all the way down to slipshod record keeping, where the next doctor to treat the patient had no idea what the previous doctor had done because the record keeping was so poor.
And this all comes at a time when the state, I mean, we talk about the budget very often on this program and everywhere else. And they're renegotiating contract with AFSCME, which represents most prison guards, and we do have overcrowding. We have a lot of people working overtime, and then the medical care is another costly item.
Correct.
So where do we go? Did the report suggest make recommendations?
It made lots of recommendations. I mean, across the spectrum, from increasing staffing to having board-certified physicians do certain things. One of the, there really was hardly an aspect of healthcare you can imagine that this report, these folks weren't critical of, and they came up with specific recommendations to fix it. Now, under Pat Quinn, when this report was commissioned and began and was ultimately issued, this was done with an eye towards settling this case. Remember, the state agreed to this panel of experts. It's not like it was imposed from somebody else. It was court appointed, yes, but the state said, you know what, maybe we should settle this case. Let's get a panel of experts in here to give us a blueprint so we can establish a roadmap to improvement. That's what the idea was. Now I'm told the Round administration has taken settlement off the table. They want to litigate this. But the larger picture of this is that this largely involves inmates who are getting on in age. You know, prison is not a place for 50, 60, 70-year-old people. They're not built to house those sorts of folks. And that's what we're ending up with. We're having an aging prison population. And the question is, if Ronald wants to, decrease prison population by 25%, within the next decade or so, I think you have to look at perhaps some compassionate release. You have to look at folks like, this person belongs in a nursing home, not a correctional institution. It's more expensive for the state. It's more expensive for the taxpayer. The inmate isn't well served. And yes, there is this tough on crime. Well, we shouldn't let these folks out of prison. But if they're in wheelchairs and hobbled up and present no danger to society at this point, it's hard to justify, at least in a lot of folks' mind. Why are these folks staying in prison at tremendous cost to the taxpayer, and frankly putting the state at risk of lawsuits if they don't provide appropriate medical care?
It's one of those rare issues, I think, where you have folks on the left and on the right actually can coalesce around this one. I mean, we've seen tons of examples in the last few years of politics and government being what we consider hopelessly divided on things. And this is one of those where they can actually align, because you've got folks who are typically conservative saying we need to do drastic things to change the budget picture, but you also have folks on the other side who are looking at examples that, that Bruce just pointed out for us of being wanting to kind of have that human element and be compassionate and help folks who are sick or injured and not going to cause harm to society. That's one of those issues that can actually get some traction. I think prisons was a $3 billion chunk of the budget.
A lot.
In the last couple of years. So we'll have to see if something like that happens.
And it's not unprecedented, too. Let's remember this. Governor Quinn was able to close down TAMS, and that was also an issue. The Supermax
The Supermax for the worst of the
And that was also an issue, I think, that both sides of the spectrum could coalesce around. To the liberal side, this is a cruel and unusual situation. To the folks on the right, this is a really, really expensive institution here, and do we really need it? And so, there are issues that folks, with regard to corrections, can actually agree on if they stop, pause, take a breath, put the rhetoric aside, and realize that folks in Texas and elsewhere, very, very conservative law and order states, haven't lost their jobs because they've gotten smarter on crime and corrections, and not just.
And I know there was a movement by a Southern Illinois legislator, I think, to reopen TAMS, but I don't think in the budget situation or with all of these other things happening that we're going to see that. Do we think there is this ongoing panel meeting, for prison reform? But I think it's the end of the year where they're supposed to report. So by the end of this legislative session, which is supposed to come at the end of May, although people think it may extend into, so yes,
in
Bruce,
Jupiter years.
Your laugh is appropriate into June or July or August even. Anything going to happen on other than perhaps the change in marijuana law that could have a real effect soon, or are we looking further down the road?
Bobcats are in trouble.
Well, we'll go into that perhaps.
I would say one thing that could be specific to Illinois, probably not, but you see it play out, is that while folks on both sides of the political spectrum can get behind some of these reforms, the appellate prosecutors and state's attorneys in general are a pretty influential group at the State House, and they've signaled, I think in a lot of cases, an unwillingness to kind of go with compassionate release by a certain age. Or
they're against that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
On the other hand, some of them, including Cook County, they are saying we're not going to even prosecute low-level marijuana cases.
Sure. Right.
Which is keeping some people out of the system.
And Mayor Emanuel got behind the ticket thing for cannabis as well. So there are exceptions, but they're a tough lobby group. I don't think they'll accept some changes readily that other people might be ready for.
And of course, Bruce, if you're talking about a compassionate release, I mean, the governor has the power to just
Absolutely.
end sentences. But that would be a very bold move.
Yeah, I think what they're talking about at the State House isn't necessarily the compassionate release thing. That, I think, has to be done almost on a case-by-case basis. You don't want to let someone who's in really good physical condition who killed a family of 8 out of prison early. That's not what we're looking for. But I think what you're looking for is maybe re-examining some of these Class X felonies. That is this really, how much of this was passed in order to keep society safe, as opposed to this was the get tough on crime du jour issue. Methamphetamine is a good example of that. I mean, there's a school of thought that says some of the methamphetamine punishments out there are a little draconian given the realities of the world today and actually the way it was then. I mean, manufacture of methamphetamine is a Class X felony. But manufacture of methamphetamine is a lot different today than it was back then. It's become easier. That doesn't excuse it at all.
More physics professors.
Yeah, but I mean, well, whichever. But at this point in time, a high school junior, with access to the internet can figure out how to make it in a 2-liter Coke bottle.
Well, let's not advertise.
Well, let's not advertise that. But you don't need all the Bunsen burners and whatnot that you once did. And so, that's just one example. And you have to also look at some of the property crimes here. I mean, I think that probably you're not going to be able to get to 25% unless you start saying, some folks who are in for property crimes, we need to reevaluate that. So it's going to be some tough calls.
We will see. Obviously, a big topic is and should be the state budget and the back and forth between the legislature and the governor. We have seen the House in particular put on some interesting votes, right to work. Speaker Madigan proposed some language that he said mirrored Governor Rauner's talking points because we hadn't, at least until, as of late, seen anything, and there were 0 votes for that. But there was also a millionaires amendment, which would be a constitutional amendment, so it wouldn't happen right away anyway, but Speaker Madigan pushed a vote to the floor of the House to say that if you make more than $1 million, then on your income over $1 million, there'd be a 3% surcharge. And where are we with that, Andy?
So
it got defeated.
The speaker brought that to the floor on Thursday for a vote. I want to say there was something like at least an hour and a half, 2-hour debate on it, give or take, and it fails by 3 votes, 68-47. It needed 71 to pass because it was a constitutional amendment.
Right.
Would have gone into effect or would have been on the ballot for voters to decide in 2016. And as you remember from 2014, there was just sort of a political question, sort of, if you will, asking voters what they thought about that. It passed overwhelmingly.
Sure,
over
people like that. Most
people
people aren't
like that
millionaires
idea,
and don't make $1 million
right.
a year, so they like to. Yeah.
But it was more of just a sort of gauging the population referendum. But the speaker brought it to the floor on Thursday. It failed. There were even some Democrats that had pretty much unanimous Republican opposition, but even some Democrats
3 Democrats,
still trepid. Scott Drury, Jack Franks, Ken Duncan even came out, I think, and voted against this. So it was it was one of those things, at least in my short time here, you never see the speaker kind of bring something that he's seemingly 100% behind to the floor, presented himself, and actually see it go down.
But on the other hand, you can, all the Republicans voted against it, I think, right?
Right.
And so you can have Democrats, and of course the Speaker is also the chairman of the Democratic Party of Illinois. They can send out flyers. You're a representative. All of those Republicans, it can be an issue. They wouldn't tax millionaires more,
and indeed,
the state
in the
wanted
few
it,
minutes
right?
after the vote, we had a statement from the Speaker's office saying Republicans had
and he
turned
called
their
it
backs on middle class.
Rauner Republicans, I think he was calling them, right?
Look, I don't believe that this thing was anything more than political theater at this point.
There's a lot of that lately.
There's a lot of that lately. We're still at the point in time where they're, if this was a play, they'd be kicking their heels high and playing the can-can. So what this is merely, I find it really difficult to believe that Madigan went into this thinking that it was going to pass. I mean, I don't pretend to be able to get inside of the Speaker's mind, but there's generally a method to his quote-unquote madness.
Well, we know. I think even my colleagues were saying Jack Franks will never vote for this. You need 71. You only have 71
Everybody
Democrats,
knew.
so it wasn't going to pass.
Yeah, everybody knew,
Right.
and so there's a method to it, and it's a Lazarus bill, so to speak. It could come back to life this session, and so this is something where it's a poker chip. I think eventually, if I'm a betting man, it's going to pass because, as you say, how many of us are millionaires? And it's got a lot of populist appeal, and so it seems like a fairly politically painless way. If you got to raise revenue, this is a lot less politically painful than a lot of other ways.
And I would add, I agree that he went into it with the knowledge that it wasn't
Right.
going to work out for him in that particular instance. I would add also that it's still rare, even if it's one of his proposals, instead of having a surrogate, a Democratic leader go out and present this and then take sort of the loss on the votes, he actually did it himself.
Yeah, I think maybe the fact that we have a multimillionaire as governor made it a lot easier for the Speaker to do this.
Absolutely,
to make these
and
arguments
that
in
was the
public.
genesis of that proposal too
Yeah.
during the campaign last year.
Yeah.
And the person who now inhabits the mansion also wants to fix that place, Bruce. There's an ongoing controversy about the governor's mansion, and there was a fundraiser this week.
Yeah, there was a fundraiser this week. They were clinking cocktail glasses. Apparently, it wasn't an open event, at least. I presume the governor was there, but he had nothing on his public schedule. I didn't get an invitation, so who knows what exactly went on. But there's an inconvenient truth here, at least according to organized labor, and that is the governor's mansion is not owned by Mr. Rauner or any private citizen. It's owned by the state of Illinois. It's a public building. And I've spoken with a union official who says, you know what? They try to renovate that governor's mansion without prevailing wage and going through the usual protocol, and we're going to sue.
Okay, do we know that's going to happen, though?
Well, what they're betting that's going to happen, and this was told to me in the strongest possible terms by a business manager for the laborers union this week. He said that, and he rightly points out that so far as we know, because Capital Development Board did not get back to me, nor did anybody from the governor's office, but he says that he spoke with folks at the Capital Development Board who said that 2-3 months ago the governor's office removed the mansion from the purview of the Capital Development Board and said, we're going to take this over. I spoke with Andy Van Meter, who's on the private association that's raising money.
He's heading the fundraising effort. He's also chairman of the Sangamon County Board.
And what he tells me is that they have an $8.8 million estimate for some repairs to the mansion. He says that came from the Capital Development Board, and now we, the association, are going to do our own analysis of this. We, the association, are going to hire our own consultant to give us perhaps a more comprehensive figure, and we'd like to start work on the roof this summer. How many folks really believe that Rauner is going to call up the union and say, hey, send us over a union shop to work on my house?
So, you're pointing out a potential controversy.
A potential, yes. Okay. Yes, it's potential, which is why I say it's emerging. And so, it could be fairly interesting. It may turn into a game of chicken here. I mean, because it would be very embarrassing, I would think, for Governor Rauner, who has had difficulty pushing his right to work elsewhere in the state, to not be able to get right to work at his own house, or at least where he's living.
But it is government owned, so we'll see.
It is government owned, yeah.
Speaking of his agenda, in the State Journal Register this week, the governor had an op-ed piece, length of legislative session up to lawmakers, and basically said, we don't care how long it takes. We're willing to work with people if they work with us, but we have to get reform in government. Now, apparently in the bills that were being introduced late in the week by Republicans to finally show what Governor Rauner said, right to work may not be one of the things that they're putting on the table, but they want changes in court cases, tort reform. They want changes in project labor agreements, again, not requiring union wages to be paid on all government projects across the state. And these are still things that are very difficult. So with the governor putting out a strong statement like that, with Mike Madigan and the Democrats putting on various shows in the legislature to say we're not going to go for this or this, including right to work, which may be off the table, how long will this session go?
It's anybody's guess right now. I think for the last few weeks we've assumed that it would probably go longer than the typical May 31st. However, there has been some talk of Democrats passing a budget that they want and getting it out of the way and getting it out of town, and then sort of leaving it in the governor's hands.
Waiting for the veto, basically.
To veto and then bring them back eventually to work on that. So it's anybody's guess right now. My view of the op-ed was him kind of trying to keep his message out there and get it to folks. But you wonder, after all of the kind of the show votes and the back and forth and everything, it's kind of like trying to find the end of the magician's handkerchief a little bit. like who's responsible for what? How much of this is being absorbed by the public? It's really hard to tell, I think.
Well, I saw it kind of as somewhat saber rattling, and when I read it, I don't understand his logic here, because what he's supposedly doing here is he's saying, I'll work with anybody who wants to work with me on my terms, and anybody that wants to do what's reasonable, and I define what's reasonable,
sure.
then we'll make progress. But he's also reportedly said, some concessions have been made, at least behind closed doors, in terms of revenue enhancement and that sort of thing. And now he's saying, well, if you don't agree with me by the end of the session, I'll pull back all the concessions and we'll press the reset button and start all over again. Yeah. I don't get that.
And as we know, the new fiscal year starts June 1st, so it's maybe by, is it mid-June or mid-July that state checks to employees could be up for grabs, and the first school payment, I think, is in August. And if there's not a budget by then we got real trouble.
Well, but couldn't they, you know, I don't know, but couldn't they do some sort of patchwork
or
legislation?
A continuing you have to have a governor's approval for that.
Correct, you
and
do.
You know, and they have to kind of get along.
But
so
they do have to kind of get along. You know, we've got the other ball in the air, of course, is negotiations with AFSCME over a contract.
And we got, and AFSCME put out a, Doug Finke, my colleague at the State Journal Register, did a story on an alert to its members that the governor wants a freeze in wages, no more step increases, all kinds of concessions that the union is not prepared to give.
Right, and one thing, if it does...
And that ends at the end of the fiscal
year.
Sure.
I don't know that Ron so much is concerned about screwing over AFSCME. You know, that he may well screwing over is a pejorative term, but at any rate, he's not so concerned about you know, doing battle with those folks, as I think he is reaching August and shorting the schools, because that's one thing that he's held pretty firm to all the way through his campaign. I'm not going to cut education.
Right.
And so if it goes that far, you know, what do you do? Does he then become the boogeyman who said, you know, sorry, your teacher can't come to class because Ronner didn't give any money?
Yeah, I think it's all going to come down to, I mean, obviously both sides, the legislature, which is dominated by Democrats, the Republican governor, are figuring out if there are cuts, if there are delays, if there is some sort of shutdown, who knows, who gets the blame. And they're all going to try to do their best spinning, and we'll see where it goes. Well, we've got about a minute left. There is pumpkin pie, which State Representative Keith Summer of Morton got this passed as the state pie, I think, and corn as the state vegetable. Is it a vegetable or not? Sam McCann, state senator from Macoupin County. So school kids wanted these things to happen. We have a lot of corn, and particularly in Morton and Sycamore, a lot of pumpkins in Illinois. A light note, finally.
This is a delicious sort of end to a debate. I don't think it was ever very contentious, but you know, look, pumpkin pie, I'm a fan of. Sweet corn, I'm a fan of as well. So, you know, at least a few accomplishments during this session.
But there's an obvious metaphor. When midnight strikes, what happens? We all turn into pumpkins. Or
something. And on that note, Bruce Rushton, thank you. Andy Maloney, thank you. I'm Bernie Schoenburg, thank you. And we'll see you next time on Capitol View.